All right, so I would love to thank you all for coming this evening to learn all about composting with worms. I think it's going to be a pretty fun presentation. I'm really looking forward to it. I'd like to first start off by respectfully acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And this includes the Blackfoot Confederacy members, Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Stoney Nakoda of Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations, the Dene of Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3, and all those that make Treaty 7 lands their home. So as treaty people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, we share responsibility for stewardship of this beautiful land, and it's Métis Week, so it's wonderful. I'm glad we get to celebrate, land and taking care of it and taking care of our soil today. It's going to be great. So today we have Mike Dorian, also known as the Compost Kid, here with us. So Mike's passion for all things soil began with a gardening class put on by the Calgary Horticulture Society. It continued with his permaculture design certificate, spin farming and greenhouse design, compost facilities operator certificate, and mentoring in soil and soil microbiology. So he's currently working on his soil food web advisor role with the Life in the Soil program, and he sits on the board of the Calgary Permaculture Guild. That's a lot of things, Mike. This is great. So thanks for joining us. We're really looking forward to learning from you this evening. And I will also say, if anyone has any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A, and I will very kindly interrupt Mike's presentation to ask the question. So thanks so much, Mike. Go right on. Let's learn.
All right, let's get into it. The world of the worms. So vermicomposting. We'll dive right into her. So before we get too deep into the worms, I just want to go through a couple questions just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that we're keeping these questions in the back of our head. So the one thing is as human beings, what are the few things that we need to survive as a species? Right? So if this was in a live version, we'd be talking to each other and conversing. So I'll just give it a pause, boom, boom, and then I'll get into it. So one would be water. Yeah, correct, Billy. That's really good. Nice one, Billy. The other one would be oxygen. Awesome. Nice gold star for you, Susan. Okay. And then we've got food, and then we've got shelter. So if we break these down into the basic components, so where does our food come from? No, not the grocery store, Jimmy. Where does it come from before that? Right? So we're looking at the basis of this connection to the soil. So our food comes from there. A lot of our oxygen comes from there by growing trees. And then a lot of our shelters are built out of either things from the soil or from the soil itself. And then even the water is cleaned and flows through the soil as well. So there's an intimate connection there as well. So it's not just all about cell phones and fancy cars. We're just going down to the basics. And then the other one is when we're working or looking at like a forest system or even a native prairie, what's going on there? Does anybody have to fertilize a forest? No, I don't think so. Does anybody have to water a forest? Besides the odd person that's gone camping or anything, but these systems have learned to take care of themselves. And so we have to start observing and figuring out, okay, so what has nature figured out already? And what can then we take from those systems and mimic in our backyard or our back 40? So as we go through those, just keep those in the back of the head because that also goes in when we're composting or we're working with our soil. We want to make sure that we're providing all those kinds of things as well to make sure that the microbes that are helping with our composting or helping in our soil to help plants grow need those attributes as well. So if we can do that, then we're going to be a lot more beneficial in our actions, but then also a lot more successful in what we're trying to accomplish. So, too fast there. So, things are very touchy on the old mouse screen here. It's not letting me do it by buttons, but so this stuff about soil, because I think we've become very disconnected from it. And I applaud all of you for being out here to learn a different technique of dealing with your waste stream, but then also a way to give back to the soil. And they knew about this stuff a long, long time ago. And I think with talking about doing our land acknowledgements, a lot of the natives and indigenous peoples were very tied to this. They were very tied into nature, and we've come too far away from that. So we need to get back into the groove. So here we go. So to have an understanding of what's going on, we need to realize that there's a difference between dirt. There's a difference between soil. We can't call them the same thing. If we start to have this this divide and this connection, then we can figure out like where we are and where we can take things. And there's also this context of, you know, treating soil a certain way. If you really want to break it down, we are actually soil. We were made out of soil. We have soil within us, the microbes within us, helping our microbiome, breaking down our food. So if we are treating it poorly all the time, then we're actually treating ourselves poorly. So I don't want to be called a dirt bag. So if we are working with soil, let's make sure to call it soil. Let's not call it dirt, because dirt is actually dead. It doesn't have anything going on for it. So we could take a seed and we could plant it in that medium, and that seed might grow, but mainly from the energy of the seed itself. Then it's going to need a lot of help, a lot of outside inputs. So this is kind of where a lot of our conventional agriculture has gotten, where that soil has been beaten up so bad that it's pretty much dirt now, and it's just a medium that they're using almost hydroponically. So you're using it as a medium that you pump chemicals in, and hopefully the plants catch it before it leaches out of the system, and then you repeat that throughout the growing season. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to feed the plant. We want to feed the soil. So this is a part of the reason why we do composting. So soil, on the other hand, a good healthy handful of soil, that is alive. There's a lot of action going on in there. So there's more life, more microbes in that handful of soil than all of the people on the whole earth, right? But they're really, 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 really tiny. So they're so small, we can't see them with the naked eye. So we have to use a microscope to see them. So these microbes, these decomposers, they work with our worms within our vermicompost bin, but they're also the ones that are responsible out in nature and in a compost pile to help decompose and break some of these things down, and then help cycle those nutrients back to the plants so that we have this process. There's no waste in nature. They take care of everything and cycle it back again. So with us being this supreme top of the food chain kind of thing, then we need to accept our roles as kind of stewards of the land and fitting into these natural systems, not trying to control them or muscle them. So part of this process is working with the soil and not against it. Now, vermicomposting, so vermi means worm. So this is worm composting. So in this process where we would typically have a normal compost pile, we're just working with the little microscopic critters, and then some of those micro and macro fauna that we can start to see with our eyes, so like the mites and springtails and that kind of stuff. But in this, we're mainly focusing on using the worm to help process most of that waste stream. And we'll talk a little bit about that relationship that they have with those microbes as well, because they're all working together to basically cycle this waste. It's just the neat thing with our worm friends is they're essentially eating whatever's in front of them, taking it within their bodies, taking what they need for their metabolic process. And when you eat and you eat and you eat, what you got to do is you got to poop. So they produce this beautiful vermicompost, which I like to classify as like Mother Nature's fertilizer. And this is the stuff that's constantly giving back to the soil. So they're the recyclers, the renewers, the refreshers of any kind of organic matter that we can find in our soil, or if we take advantage and put them in our bin. Okay. Now a little history here. Now Cleopatra we all know her, right? She was this edgy ruler in Egypt during the pyramid times. Well, she was a bit of a badass. She actually liked her worms and realized how much that they were responsible for renewing their soil. But then they also actually did vermicomposting to help rid some of their food waste and then produce that beautiful castings to go back into the gardens. But respected them so much that when she realized their value, she tried to pass it on to her followers. And if anybody ever harmed a worm, punishable by death. Imagine if we had those kind of rules back again. Man, there'd be a lot of people that wouldn't be around. But so that's pretty cool that there was that respect and that basically honor to those organisms for doing what they do. And then Charles Darwin, as he was starting to look more and more into the animals and the changes of evolution and all that stuff, he really took on some liking to the lowly earthworm as well. And he actually wrote a whole book just on earthworms. Really, really interesting read. I've read some parts of it. It's just some of that old English is kind of hard to get through. But just this one passage that he has here really just nails it on its head. And this is back in 1881, so still really, really plugged in. So again, we've become kind of distanced from this. I see the amount of times I go into a classroom and I say that I've got worms and that, oh, we're going to get a chance to touch worms. And most of the children get really afraid and upset. And there's some that will scream bloody murder and leave the classroom. But it's such a simple creature and that connection to the soil and us to grow food to feed ourselves. So I hate to see that in some of the children, and I do my best to try to get most of them really comfortable to get back to that state again. But we've got some work to do. So the other part of the history is so the main worm that we typically use, which we'll get into on the next slide, the Eisenia fetida, or the red wiggler. It's originally actually from the Middle East. And so I've actually found it on some farms within the province, just because when some of our old settlers came over, they used to use these to handle their manure piles back on the farm. So it was just a way to process the waste and create something that you didn't have to do a bunch of the work. You just let the worms do it, and then you could put that back out into the garden or into the fields. And then these worms have also become quite popular because of their defense mechanism of doing their wriggle dance, hence their name, red wiggler. They're really good on a fishing hook. So once you pierce them, they start thrashing around and they're really good at attracting fish. Now, there has been a bit of hesitancy and some blame game going on of some fishermen taking these worms out into our wilds, out into the forests and kind of our native lands, and then throwing the fish or the worms back into the ground if they didn't use them all. And then they're started to populate, and there was a website that was going on for a while that was showcasing how they were disturbing some of the native ecology within some of these forest systems. But that website has since closed down, and I don't know if they lost funding or if they just came around full circle and it maybe wasn't as a big deal as possible. So let's try to keep these worms within our bins and not just be throwing them out willy-nilly, because we still need to do some research there to figure out what the buzz is. So our little friends, so Eisenia fetida, so the red worms, the red wiggler. So where when it rains, we'll start to see those big worms on the sidewalk and stuff. So those are called night crawlers, or some people will call them dew worms because they come up in the nighttime. And those guys are tunneling worms. So they like to tunnel deep tunnels down into the soil. And then, so a lot of them are hibernating down there for the winter. And then they'll come up past the frost levels in the spring again. But if we try to put those guys in a bin, they're just going to be pretty upset because their natural instinct is to tunnel. So they're not going to be happy. We want to make sure our worms are happy. So these guys the old red worms, they like to be used as the composting worm for the main fact that in their native habitat, they like to stay at the top levels of the soil. So we can put them in a bin and they're going to be totally happy there. They're a little bit more resilient to that. So some of these other worms, like there are names for them. So the tiger worm or the red worm, or California really tried to take the name from them and run with it. So, but there is a lot of actually vermicomposting operations down in California. So maybe that's why it's kind of come around that way. But really, really good worm. So that's the main type. There are others that you can use. My good friends down at Earthly Matters, they so it's a vermiculture operation down in Coaldale, just outside of Lethbridge. They also use the European night crawlers. They're a little bit of a bigger worm, and then they've got deeper bins, so they can go a little bit deeper, and then they create a little bit of a bigger casting, but then also they seem to have a little bit more of a voracious appetite as well. But then I've also seen there's a company out in Manitoba called Overton Environmental, and they actually put their red wigglers, the European night crawlers, and the African night crawlers all together, and then just have them just in as a mishmash, eating up all from their bin styles. So there's different ways of just using different worms, depending on what kind of process you want to do, and also the fact, do you want to be really serious about this and make it as an operation, or do you want them just to process some food waste, right?
Okay,
So
Mike,
some
quick
of the
question.
used in the process too. Oh, do you got a question, Ginny?
I do have a question. So if these worms aren't our dew worms or night crawlers, then would they die if they were out in nature here? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
because they don't know to burrow down below the frost level, yeah, winter will take them out. But it does seem from some research that sometimes their cocoons seem to overwinter. So we can still seem to get uh, some growth kind of going on forward from that. So there is still needs to be a little bit more research done on that and see kind of what that looks like and how long they will actually last. But for the most part, I've only seen it in a handful of kind of raised beds, so they weren't connected to the earth anyway. But it is something to be mindful of.
Okay.
So some of these other worms, we've got like the India blue, so they actually have a bit of a blue tinge to them. And then I haven't seen these ones yet myself, but the Alabama jumpers, they've got like a black head and they'll actually jump up into the air. So, these are things that you don't take into the classroom and try to convince kids to get a little more friendly with nature and your worm friends. You don't want them jumping out on kids. So just some other options to look at for the worms. Now, a little bit about the worms themselves. So, a pretty simple creature. Okay, they've got no eyes, they got no ears, they got no nose. They just got a mouth and their sexual organs and a butt. So they just pretty much eat and poop, right? So maybe that's a good thing for some people in their lives, but you know, they only do what they can. And then the neat thing about them is I've had a few kids go, "Oh, I got bit by a worm." And it's like, well, it might not have been an earthworm. So they don't have teeth. So like our friends, the chicken, they're taking food into their mouth, and then it goes into the crop. The crop is kind of a holding station, and then it gets a little bit of mix in there with different items from the soil. So they're kind of looking for grit and stuff. And then as that stuff gets moved into the gizzard acts like kind of a strong muscle and squishes and crushes everything in there. So the neat thing about the worms is they're not actually getting their nutrition from, say, like the leaf residue or things that are decomposing in the ground. They're actually getting it. So if this little worm here, sorry, she worm ate a piece of leaf and brought it into its crop and gizzard, and then it crushed it, it would actually be getting its nutrition from the bacteria and the fungi and the protozoas and nematodes that are coating that piece of leaf, trying to decompose and break it down. So then they're popping them and swallowing their cytoplasm, and that's where they actually get their nutrition. So that's why worms can actually be an indicator out in our native soils to showcase that we actually have some biological life happening in our soils. You can watch videos of when tractors used to rototill the fields back in like the 70s and sometimes the early 80s too. And you'll see birds just flying all behind the tractors because as they're tilling and turning that field, they're bringing all the earthworms up to the surface. And then the birds are coming and just having a little buffet style. But you see a tractor do that now, and we're getting better at not tilling the fields, but it's still happening. These birds you don't see any birds behind them anymore. So it's kind of a big slap in the face indicator of like, okay, we got some stuff to fix here. And then another neat little thing is just the worms have 5 hearts. And we still don't really know why they have 5 hearts, but I've got a little bit of a theory. You want to hear my theory of why they have 5 hearts? I think worms have 5 hearts is because they have so much love to give. Oh yeah, corny.
Wah, wah, wah. That was awesome.
Okay, so a little bit of a difference here. So if you're looking into this process, you're going to come across people talking about vermicomposting, and you're going to have people talking about vermiculture. So vermicomposting is the actual process of using worms to break down food waste to produce the amendment of soil, the amendment of worm castings, aka worm poop. So that's the main process. Vermiculture is actually the process of raising worms. So this is where we would look at those fishing worms. So I've met a handful of people where they just are growing worms to sell as bait for fishermen, and they're just taking all their castings and just throwing it into the field, the next field. They thought it was a complete waste resource. So very interesting. So we actually have right now in the province, we're very lucky, is we have a big vermicomposting operation up in Edmonton area called Annalita. So they're using the worms to break down food waste and dealing with that kind of stuff that way. And then we have a pretty good operation doing vermiculture down in Coaldale. So that's the Earthly Matters company I was talking about earlier. But Dan is growing worms, but he's also doing it to really tie in his worm castings as well. So he works with a lot of backyard growers and small time farmers and cannabis growers and stuff as well. And some of those guys are really anal. Once they have a product that works, they don't want it to change. So he's able to produce a product that's very consistent. Where the vermicomposting, you're always going to have different foods being fed to those worms. So that composition of that end product is always going to be a little slightly different. It's going to have some pretty similarities, but this is where you could do vermiculture and vermicomposting, mix them together, and then diversity. And that could provide us with a lot more stuff to add to our gardens. Okay, so that's good to know that stuff. Oh, man, this thing is moving fast. Okay, so the 5 essentials. So these are the basic things that we want to make sure that we've got dialed in so that our worm friends are going to be happy and that then they can just work on doing what we want them to do, and that's dealing with our food waste or our waste stream and producing that beautiful worm castings, Mama Nature's fertilizer that we can put back into our gardens to grow more healthy food. So the whole closed loop thing. So the 5 essentials, we want to make sure that they've got a really comfortable setting. So that's when we're using what we call bedding. We use a lot of that in our vermicomposting operations. So then the food source, what are we feeding them, and is it being consistent, or is it all over the place? And what does that look like to make it easier for them to eat? And then they always need a certain amount of moisture. And we'll talk about that. And then oxygen is always the key one. So remember, we're talking about some of these things that we needed as a species to survive. Well, they need some of these things too. And then a little different from our normal composting, the vermicomposting, we need to stay within a certain temperature extreme. Okay. So let's dive into some of these a little bit more. So if I shrunk us down really small and we crawled down into the soil, would it be light or dark down there? Be dark, right? So we want to make sure that we're putting them in a bin that's going to have darkness. I remember doing a presentation or a workshop, sorry, with the zoo, and they went out and bought bins before I had gotten there, and they bought a bunch of clear bins. So that's, unless they were really deep and wide, then maybe the worms could hang out in the middle of it. But then you're not going to get a lot of action until you shut the lights off with those worms hitting the sides. So having a bin that's going to be dark or made out of a material that's dark so that we're holding that darkness. Now, another thing, kind of a little segue on that. So if we look at a worm, are they kind of dry or moist looking, right? Because they don't have eyes, so they can't see the sun, but they're slightly sensitive to the light. Not so much the ones that are inside, but the real big one that's outside, the sun. So if we look at the worm, they're very moist. Now, do we know why they have a certain kind of sheen or moisture to them, right? So they are living in a moist environment, so they are likely to be moist themselves. And it is going to help them kind of weave and squeeze through the soil profiles. But the biggest one is where we use our nose, our schnozzles, to breathe oxygen into our body. They actually use that moisture on their skin to breathe through their skin, right? So that's pretty cool. So we want to make sure that our bin has a certain amount of moisture to it. Now, when we do regular composting, we're using the squeeze test, right? We're grabbing that handful that we've made and we're squeezing it, and we're just getting a couple drops coming out of it. So that's what we call about 50%. So in a worm bin, we can go a little bit wetter. They've got a little bit more resiliency to that. But then part of that tool, so we want to observe what's going on in our bin, but then we also want to use our nose for unpleasant smells. So if we are starting to get any kind of anaerobic smells, or like things that smell like ammonia or rotting or rotten eggs, like all the very attractive smells, then we know that we've got some kind of issues. And typically the biggest problem is a high moisture rate. We've gone above that 60%, and now we're getting the pore spaces being filled with moisture, and so things are starting to go anaerobic. So we want to keep them aerobic. So aerobic means lots of oxygen or oxygen loving, where anaerobic is very little oxygen or oxygen hating. So that starts to produce the microbes that we're not so happy with. So being mindful of that. And we'll talk a little bit about some techniques that we can use in just regular bins to kind of mitigate that as well. And then the other one is oxygen. So we want to make sure that we have a bin that we've either poked some holes just in the lid of a Rubbermaid or around the edges, or perhaps we're using a material that is breathable itself. So there's some different styles like the worm ins that are made out of like canvas bags, so air freely flows through them. So we want to make sure that it's oxygen. Again, that anaerobic side will start to show up with the smells. So we want to make sure we got high levels of the O2. Okay, and then the food side. So this is the main reason why we're using our little worm friends, is to make sure that they're eating and processing some of our waste streams. So instead of us chucking it into the landfill and sending it to the city dump to have them deal with our issues and problems, I think everybody should compost, because then you get a lot more savvy on how you do your shopping, but then also you have that much more respect for your food. Like think about all the energy that goes into that food grown, and then the time and energy a farmer or somebody puts on to growing that, or puts into growing that food, and then we get it at a restaurant or something, and somebody's cooked it and put all that time and energy into it, and we eat half of it and then throw the rest away, right? Like it's kind of disrespectful. So we need to have a little bit more respect for our food, because with prices getting as high as they are and stuff right now, it might not be as an abundant and open to different varieties and stuff. Maybe we'll have to go back to eating a lot more seasonally, not getting watermelons, bananas anytime that we want. So just having that kind of respect. So the worms can eat a pretty wide variety of stuff. Now, the one thing I like to point out with the worms is they like to keep it a bit smaller, right? So if we did something like coffee grounds, for example, well, coffee grounds are pretty small, and worms have little itty bitty mouths. So it's pretty easy for a worm to squiggle up to a coffee ground and be able to eat that. So we can make sure that the smaller the food, the faster that they can process some of this stuff, right? Now, some things to be mindful of. If we put in some raw onion, now we've seen cutting into an onion, right? You get all emotional and you're like, oh, I'm so sorry, onion, for giving you the chop chop. So what's happening there is when we cut into an onion, it's giving off these like unseen vapors called phenols. And when these particular ones are very sensitive to mucous membranes. So our eyes start to water, our nose starts to run. So if we look at our worm friend again, they're very moist on the outside, right? So their whole body is like a mucous membrane. So that raw onion or even raw garlic, that's going to be very harmful to them. So we don't want to put that stuff in. If we cook it, it pulls those phenols out. We could put that in, or the papery skin on the outside, no problems. We can put that stuff in as well. And then when we look at our meat and dairy products, now I had a farmer friend kind of beat me on this quite a few years back, where he was like, okay, we don't put meat, we don't put dairy products in our compost bin, or we don't feed them to our worms. Now, the main reason why we don't put them in our worm bin is because we're just dealing with typically a 53-liter Rubbermaid. That's the most common bins that I've seen. And that stuff's just going to end up rotting in there before the worms get a chance to actually do much with it. He used to take his culled chickens and throw them down into his basement, which was a giant worm bin. And he's like, oh, yeah, after a couple days, you wouldn't see them. But he was doing something a lot more large scale, and he wasn't too concerned with bad smells down there. But these kinds of things we don't want to put in the bin just because we will have a higher chance of probably producing some kind of pathogen as that starts to rot and stink into those bins. So these kinds of items we can throw into our green bin and send to our municipalities or our city's giant compost operations, and they can deal with it a lot more easier. Now, the other one is citrus fruit. So lemons, limes, grapefruits, oranges. Now, this kind of stuff is highly acidic. So if we put too much of that material, this acidic material, in our enclosed environment, this artificial environment we've created for our worms, well, then they're going to get a bit upset. They're not going to be very happy. So this kind of stuff, we want to put very little in at a time. It'll really depend on how far along your bin is, and what kind of temperatures and stuff that you're keeping it at as well, so that the worms are actually processing stuff. And I also find that the bedding really starts to keep this a lot more functionable. And a little trick, and I think I talk about this later, but if you start to see conditions getting acidic, you will get these little pot worms show up. And you could start to balance that kind of stuff out by using crushed eggshells or what else was it we were using for that? Oh, it was oyster shell and stuff too. But the crushed eggshells works really, really well for that, just as a pH balancer. And then the other one thing to be mindful of is our spicy foods, right? You think the worms are like it as spicy foods? I don't think they like it as spicy foods. So no spicy for the worms, a capiche? So this kind of stuff we don't want to put in there, as we know it's very sensitive to our mucous membranes again too. So very, very a no-no for our worms. Now, if you've got stuff like, say, like a pasta sauce or some kind of food waste that has some kind of sauce or something on it, and you're not sure, then do a little citizen science stuff. Take a little bit and put it in the corner of the bin, and then give it a few days and see if the worms start to interact with it. If they interact with it, well then okay, we've got something that they can eat. But if not, then okay, well I'll scoop that back out, and I know now that this is an item that I don't want to put in there. Don't be afraid. The worms are pretty resilient. Okay, and then temperature. This is the one where we're looking at when we do regular composting, we've got a big varied range of when we can do this process. So with our worms, specifically too with the red wigglers, they're originally from the Middle East. So they're used to these kinds of like that 15 to 25 degree area. Now, if we keep them in that window, that is actually where that'll keep their metabolism the most happy. So then they'll eat more and they'll reproduce a lot faster too. We can put them down into colder areas. My friend Glenn Monroe with the Compost Council of Canada did some trials and tests out on the East Coast where they were doing worm bins and piles and stuff out in barns and different areas that were going down to different temperatures. And they were actually getting, some of the worms were going down into the little minus areas, like -3, -4. So just a little bit of a crust would form over them so that they could just kind of hang out in there. But their metabolism goes down and they start to move real slow. So they're not going to really eat a lot for us. So they're not going to be very helpful. So they can go down to those temperatures, but you're not going to get that much work out of them. And then if you do ever move your bin outside or you're moving it around, say a classroom or whatever, I remember a maintenance guy put one of the bins on right on the heat register and he cooked them. So that wasn't good. But then also if they're sitting in a window and you've got this bin, so we've got the ambient temperature of what outside of the bin is, but if the sun is shining on it, it'll start to create a higher temperature in there. So we want to be mindful of these things too, because when the worms get in a position where they're uncomfortable, they will try to leave en masse. And coming into a classroom or a room and seeing a bunch of worms all over the floor, yeah, it's not a pretty sight. Not a pretty sight. Okay, and then oh, might have missed that one, but let's talk about then the bedding side. So this is a typical Rubbermaid bin. You can do either having holes on the side like this, or you could do holes on the top, or a combination of the both. I found just doing some holes on the top of the lid just works fine, and they don't seem to be bothered too much about it as long as we keep it all light and fluffy. Now, bedding, I would say, is the top number one thing to being successful at vermicomposting. So if we think of the food waste that we're putting into our bin to feed the worms, now food waste is inherently very high in moisture. It's got a high moisture content. So when we're just putting all that in there and the worms are starting to eat and it's starting to decompose and break down, because our friends, the bacteria and the fungi are going to be showing up in numbers too to help out with this, that moisture's got to go somewhere, right? So we don't want it to become a little soupy mess in this bin. So by adding bedding, it gives the worms kind of a place to hang out, but then it also helps to regulate our moisture content. And then another bonus of it is if we keep it really full with the bedding and we're putting the food down at the bottom and covering it with the bedding will also act as a bit of a carbon filter. So say you got a couple bananas on the counter and they end up hatching out some fruit flies. Well, now the fruit flies won't be able to find another mass to start to breed out in your worm bin because you'll have that bedding covering that. Some really easy bedding material would be shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard works really well. Those are both very simple and easy to use. Don't be worried about the color in the newspaper. All that is all vegetable and soy-based inks now, so they're all pretty safe. The only ones that you don't want to use are the ones that are shiny. So those have a chemical process that has made them glossy. So we don't want to put that kind of stuff in. That can just go to the recycling plant. And then I've used shredded leaves. I've used straw, dry straw. And then we've played around with just even using, so some people have used cocoa coir and stuff as well, or peat, but these are ones that I'd like to get away from a little bit more just because they're a bit unsustainable on how they've been processed or harvested. And then we've even played around with just using wood chips. And then depending on what you're mixing in for the food waste, you can get a really good kind of substance that or just like the texture of it that the worms can really nibble down. But then you've got that bulky material, so things stay pretty aerated. So you can play around with all those kinds of different mixes of bedding. And I always try to use quite a bit. So I would fill the bin right to the top, and then always have that little bit of a layer. And then what I'll do sometimes, and I'll explain this too in on talking about some of the different bin styles, is I'd put either a little piece of newspaper, like full piece on top that would be moistened, or some burlap or like a coffee bag or something like that, and then keep that moist, and then that'll help keep the moisture in the bin a little bit longer. But then also now that becomes an indicator for me. So it's, if I pop the lid and that top layer is really dry, then I need to check to make sure that the moisture level is okay for the worms down below. Once you get the bin going, after like a month and a half, 2 months, you should be able to have enough moisture in there. It's almost like it's creating its own climate. So then you'll never have to add moisture again. There should be enough in there in the food waste just to keep the things rocking and rolling. Did I see a question come up, or do we want to do some of those after, Ginny?
Yeah, we got one question. Janelle's asking, how much food waste can a typical bin handle per week?
Yeah, so you don't want to look at it as just a bin style. You want to look at it as how many worms you have. So the typical saying says a pound of worms can eat a pound of food a day. So I like to cut that in half because that would be in ideal conditions. So I like to say a pound of worms will eat a half a pound of food a day. And so what I do is when I'm starting out is I'll put the food in one corner, I'll put the worms in the other corner, have it all filled up with my bedding, and then I can take a peek after a couple days and see how long it takes the worms to get used to their new bin, but then also once now they're into the food, how long is it going to take them to process that? So there's a couple things that are going to come down to that. So one is going to be that temperature range. So if they're in that 15 to 25, then that's going to be where their metabolism is the happiest. So they're going to be go, 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 let's eat. Two is going to be what's the size of that food. So say, for example, if we put a banana peel in, they're not going to swallow it whole. They're not a python, right? But what we can do to help them speed up that process is we can cut it up into smaller pieces. So when we do that, that creates more surface area that's now allowing the bacteria and the fungi and the protozoans and nematodes to get in there and start helping with that decomposition process as well. Or to take it even further, we could chuck that banana peel in a blender and make a banana peel smoothie, and then just pour that in, and then they can slurp that up really, really fast. So there's not that much process to them crushing and breaking it down, right? So those are the three bases of keeping. Then the last one is having a certain amount of grit. So because they use their gizzard, the gizzard it's pretty flat. It's a smooth muscle, right? So if we rubbed our hand in the palm of our hand, we're starting to do friction there. We can feel a little bit of heat. Well, both these surfaces are pretty smooth. We could probably do that for quite a while and we'd be okay. But what would happen if I sprinkled a little bit of sand on my hand and started to do that? Ouch! That'd start to wear the skin away on my hand. And if I did it long enough, I'd start to bleed. So that's what we're looking for is grit. The same thing with the chickens. They're eating and swallowing some of the soil and that dirt or tiny rocks and pebbles so that they can get these things stuck in their gizzard, and it acts more like sandpaper and it grinds their food up into a paste before they swallow it. So part of the thing of adding into our bin is either a handful of soil, or we can sprinkle some sand in there, or we can crush up eggshells really small and sprinkle those in there too. And then some of that calcium carbonate will get stuck in the gizzard and help that process too. So that's the best, those three things. If we have those ideal, then the worms are going to be super happy and they're going to mouth through a ton of food. And then as they start to grow and reproduce, which we'll talk about, then you'll be able to add and increase the volume of food that you'll be able to put in. So some different styles. This is a guy that reached out to me actually in India. And so they're just using like old milk kind of crates, but they're longer ones. And they just stack them on top of each other, and they're making their own flow through systems. So they would put worms at the bottom with their food, and then once that one gets full, then they put the next one on top, and then put the food on the second one, and then the worms keep coming up into the next bin and the next bin and the next bin. So by the time they're near the top, they can pull those off and then harvest that bottom one. Boom, really simple. So it's just a little bit of a different style with using what they have with waste resources and stuff. So I thought that was kind of a neat one. And then some people just want to make their own bins. So this is kind of a similar one, but it's just a shelving kind of unit with using like chicken wire as the bottom hold. And then each shelf on top is just another chicken wire so that then the worms can flow up through the process. I've actually seen somebody that built something similar to this, like this, but it was a coffee table in the middle of their living room. So, you know, like whatever floats your boat, depending on what you look like. So I'll show a couple more slides of another fancier worm bin that will explain more of this kind of flow through system. So these are just kind of some more do-it-yourself kind of models. So this is the worm factory. So this was kind of a fancier worm bin. When we look at our Rubbermaid, it's a little bit harder to harvest some of that worm castings out of there. So these kinds of designs have made it a lot easier to harvest the worms, but then also harvest the worm castings, but then we're not disturbing the worms as much. And then we can get a couple other benefits and stuff from it too. So what we have here is we've got the base of it, which collects all that liquid. So if we don't have enough bedding in there and we're just feeding, then we have a certain amount of liquid that'll collect. So they actually have a place to collect that, and then you can drain it off and use that. We'll chat about that a little bit more here shortly. And then they start that first tray. So the first tray is where the worms are in, and then you're feeding them. And then as they're eating and they fill that bin up with worm castings, then you just put the next tray on, right? And then you start putting the food in that next tray. And so because they're all perforated, the worms can come up through the next tray to where the food is. And then you can go 3 or 4 tray levels up. By the time the worms are up in that top tray, you can pull those other trays off, grab the bottom one, boom, harvest the worm castings. There might be a few straggler worms in there. You know, I don't want to hang out with the mainstream people. The mainstream worms, and then you just put them back in, and then you can put that empty tray back on the top again and just continue that process, right? So it's just a really slick, simple, easy design. Really simple. I've worked with these quite a while, so depending again on budget or space, these are definitely a little bit more expensive, but you know, they're going to last you forever if you're treating it right. So just a cool way to look at the flow through system. So this just gives you a little breakdown of a little bit different on what that kind of looks like. Okay, so we've got the collection at the bottom, collecting that leachate, or what people call worm tea. I don't fully call it that way. So if we're using a Rubbermaid, and say we've got all that bedding in there, but it is just not doing it because maybe the food that we are keep adding in there is just a lot more higher content than the average person. Then what we could do is we could drill just a few little tiny holes in the bottom of it and put it on a few bricks or a couple pieces of 2x4 or something with a little tray underneath, and we could collect some of that as well if we needed to. So there's different ways of tweaking and adjusting your bin as it starts to evolve. So we've got the worm castings being harvested at the bottom, and then the bedding and the worms moving up through the process. Just a little different side view of looking at what it looks like. Okay, and then these are some different styles. I've played around with these a little bit. So the worm in, or the urban worm bag. There's a lady out in I believe she's in Creston or Cranbrook area that sells these. And so the idea with these is you're taking, so think of like almost like a big laundry bag. So the bag has got a zipper top, and then at the bottom it's just a cinch tie off. So you can start feeding your worms and the bedding and everything at the bottom, and then just keep adding food to the top. So as the worms are eating and processing that stuff, and as they get higher and higher to the top of it, then most of the worms should be hanging out at the top of this bag. And then you should be able to pull the drawstring open and let out some of the castings really slowly, and then close it up once you start getting kind of food waste again. And then just continue that process. They work really good. They can hold a ton of volume, but the only downfall I found was just because in Alberta here it's so dry, it's like a desert. You had to feed really, really wet, or I found I was moistening the bin quite a bit, and so you have to be careful of that sometimes because in the water process, just like when we're using it in composting or even with our gardens, we have to realize that a lot of the water that we're using with the cities got chloramine or chlorine in it, which the purpose of that is to essentially kill bacteria. So if we use too much of these waters, they can salt out. If you put water in a dish or a jug or something and let it sit off to the side, it'll naturally gas off that chlorine. And then you can use that, or you could use a little bit of humic acid to add into that to kind of tie it up. But I was on a farm at one place, and the water was super hard, and just it naturally had a high salt level, and it just didn't work for my worms. So I had to do the worms in a different place. So that's just a different style. It's not my favorite, but we're gonna try them in the greenhouse where maybe the humidity level will be a little bit higher, so we might be able to get away with just that level of not having to water them all the time. So just a little different look of it, what it looks like on the inside. And then this is a little picture of something that my Leaf Ninja buddies were doing back in the day, where they would just take a reusable grocery bag, drill a few holes in a 5-gallon pail, and then just fold the grocery bag over the pail, and then just do like a little urban bag right inside the bucket. Then you put the lid on and it holds everything down. So then you've got a place for it to drip down into the bottom of the bucket for the leachate, and then they're getting lots of good airflow, but then you're not drying out because it's contained within the bucket too. So just a little easy do-it-yourself kind of version. All right, some of our little tips and tricks. So freezing the food beforehand, that helps break some of the cell walls of some of the food waste. So then it when it starts to thaw, it actually goes into more of kind of a mush. So then it's a lot easier for the worms to process. But then another double whammy with that is when we're adding, say, tropical fruits like banana peels and whatnot, they already are covered within fruit fly eggs and that kind of stuff. So that'll kill that cycle and not let them breed out and cause a havoc and infestation in your place. And then, like I said before, lots and lots of bedding. So I'm shredding up newspaper all the time, or I've got a little shredder that I converted for shredding my receipts and stuff. I've ripped off the bottom, and I can put strips of cardboard through there and just shred that stuff up. But then I've also made friends with some people that have some big shredders too, so we'll do some more shredding down the road. And then that small food, small mouths, small food. So then that way they can be able to process the stuff a lot quicker. Adding those eggshells are really good for helping with the grit, but then also that base of that calcium carbonate, it's like adding to soil or lime to the soil to help with the alkalinity. So we're adjusting that pH. Just because most of the food that we're going to be adding is going to be on a little bit more on the acidic side, but that'll come down to how the bedding is helping with that and whatnot as well. And then this has always been just a little thing for me is people that get worms, they're all excited and they want to get their worms. They get their worms and they're like, oh man, I got to make a bin for them. I got to make a home for them. So make the bin first and then get the worms, and we can add the worms to it once you got them. That's just a little easier because I've seen some people accidentally murder their worms and then they have to get some more. So we want to try to prevent that. All right, so the harvesting side. So in those flow-through designs, we saw that it was really easy to harvest, but in the Rubbermaid style, it's a little bit more difficult. So if you do go this route, these are just some easy ways to make it a little simpler on you. So one is just dumping the whole thing out. And I try to convince most of my daughter's friends to come over and help us dig through worms. So get some kids in there, get them helping out, right? And then a little style that you can do is you can form them into these little mounds, and then either doing it outside during the daylight, or you could have a really bright light shining above you. Then the worms will all just, they'll naturally go down to the bottom. So then as you start to kind of sweep away the worm castings, you'll have a little ball of worms hanging out at the bottom. Okay, so that's a little easy style to do there. And then another one is, if you don't want to dump everything out of the bin, what I do is I don't feed the worms for like a week or two. I just have some of the bedding in there, and then I'll get something that they really like, you know, melon rinds or watermelon rinds, or like squished apples and stuff. And I'll put it just on one side of the bin. And then most of your worms should be able to migrate to that side, be like, oh, we haven't been fed in so long. Let's get the food. So they all mass rush over there and they're mowing on that. And then you can scoop out the other side. And then what I would do is, like, a couple weeks later, then feed that other side with some new bedding, and then have the worms attract over to that side. And then you can scoop out the other side. So just a little tricks and tips for doing some of the harvesting and stuff. So why would we want to work with earthworm castings, right? You know, why don't we just compost? Well, like I said earlier, by doing vermicomposting and doing regular composting, we're just getting that much more diversity of the microbes and the nutrient availabilities that we'll be adding back to our soil, right? So the worms, they're actually kind of like neat little alchemists. Like, they'll take in a unit of calcium and they'll put out like five. And it's just like, what? So there's still some things that we don't fully understand. And all these natural fertilizers. So when we look at, say, a really good compost or vermicompost, we're not going to ever have that high levels of NPK that we're used to seeing on most of our fertilizer boxes or bags. So when we're seeing those levels on those fertilizers, we have to remember that all that stuff is water soluble. So most of those nutrients, if we have a heavy rain event, or if we're watering really heavy, we're going to wash all those nutrients out of the system. So that's typically what's happening with a lot of our big ag is, you know, say they're doing 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Well, the plant's only going to be able to grab maybe 20 or 30% of that, and the rest is just thrown away. So no wonder we have most of our farmers having to work off farm just to keep the food flowing off that place. So we gotta be a little bit smarter and a little bit more efficient with these. So in these kinds of amendments, that, let's just call them that, is when we're adding that, a lot of the nutrients are tied up within the microbes. We look at the bacteria as like little bags of fertilizer, and then they're have that interaction with the plant, where then they figure out, okay, a symbiotic relationship of, okay, I've got some sugar, you've got some calcium for me, what can we do to have an exchange? So that's where we start to see this more natural balance of the soil and the organisms within the soil feeding our plants. So that's where the earthworm castings really help with that. And so that helps with that slow release of the nutrients as the plant needs it, instead of just like a big whack into the soil and be like, hey, take up what you can and let the rest go. But then as we start to get stronger and stronger relationships between the plant and the plant roots, then that actually makes that plant root stronger. So now it's going to be a lot more susceptible, or sorry, not susceptible to disease and pathogens. It's going to be a lot more resilient for that stuff. And then if we look at what the worm castings are, it's essentially soil. It's high grade organic matter. So we're going to have great moisture retention in there. We're going to get that sponge, crumbly feeling that we want to see in our soil. And then it's going to allow good aeration down through it too. So think of roots being able to go down through that stuff a lot easier than hitting those compacted layers. And yeah, it's got no smell, it's odorless. I actually, when I go into the classrooms, I tell the kids too that you can eat it. And I've eaten it a few times. Don't try to do it in the classrooms because you need to drink a lot of water to wash it down, but it's totally safe for you. Like think the amount of times that you've pulled, carrots or something from the garden, or you've been playing in the grass, you're touching this stuff before. It's part of who we are. They're actually taking high-end probiotics and they're making healthy soil. That's where they're driving those probiotics for people to take as pills for. So earthworm castings is a big part of that, and really easy to use in indoor and outdoor plants. So just some ways of putting it to use. I'm not going to go through all these, but we'll share the slide deck with you so you can cruise through these as you want. But using them in, especially in potted plants, because they don't have any way of organisms coming in and bringing stuff from subsoils or mixing and moving stuff around. Most of those soils are pretty inert and don't have a whole lot of life in them. So adding some kind of worm castings and at least getting that microbial level of life in there, you're going to start to see a lot more response. Uh, from annuals to perennials, we like to make seeding mixes a lot using the worm castings and stuff as well, because it actually helps with germination and establishment of a lot of our plants. And then I think it's funny that he always puts the roses on there, but we like to grow the roses too. It's a good female plant, good female energy there. And then it's really easy to use for top dressing on lawns. It is definitely a little bit more expensive than your regular compost, but most our composts are kind of chunky and not very uniform. That's the bonus of the worm castings. It's so fine and easy to work with, and especially on doing the new stuff too. And when you're doing seeding, if you are doing seeding, don't ever just leave the seeds just on top. Cover them with a nice layer of protection, whether that's a compost or vermicompost or a nice layer of mixed soil. And then the best with the worm castings is I like making like the compost teas or the extracts. So because there's so much life and nutrient value within the castings, doing a tea is such a great way to extract a lot of that nutrient and those microbes, and then just taking it that much further. So you can take a cup of worm castings and make a 5-gallon pail of casting extract or tea, which now you can spread out all over your garden. Just a little way to take it a lot further. So on that as a segue, so you can use those castings to make an extract or a tea. So whether that's thrashing it around in a bucket or massaging it in a paint strainer bag or using an aerator and actually bubbling it, it is not the same thing as that leachate or that worm wee, as a company in New Zealand calls it. So that leachate that comes down, it has actually got a little bit of an anaerobic tendency to it. So there might be a little bit of a smell to it. But what we can do with that is we can use that and water it down kind of 1 to 10 with water. And now we can use that because there's still lots of nutrients in it, and a little bit of microbial activity as well. And we can use that and add that onto our plants. So you're getting a little bit of a double whammy. You can have the solid worm castings, but then the leachate can be used quite powerfully as well. And then a little side note with the reproduction of worms. So worms are unique in nature in the fact that they're hermaphrodites. So they're both male and female. And this is beneficial because if you look at anything in nature, their main purpose is to essentially reproduce, right? Like even the vegetables that we're growing in our garden, they produce fruit with seeds in it to have babies, but then we take that stuff away. So we got to give back to them. But I digress here. So with the worms, they're both male, female. They're in the dark and they have no eyes. So when they bump into another worm, they just want to take full advantage and make sure that they can get it done. So I've seen this live a few times. It's not pretty. It looks like it kind of hurts. But if we look at a worm, they've got that kind of different colored band closer to their head. So that's called the clitellum, or the band-aid, or the saddle. And that'll show up on an adult worm as being their reproductive organs. So that's where they'll do the pass by. So they almost kind of tie each other in a bit of a knot. And then each one will pass the different eggs and sperm back and forth to produce a cocoon each. So that's what the little cocoon will look like. It's about the size of a matchstick, just the tip of a matchstick. And when they're first laid, they're kind of more of like a milky kind of white. And then as they start to mature over a 6 to 10 week period, they'll turn into kind of a golden brown, kind of a toasted brown. And then when they hatch, 1 to 5 worms will come out of that little cocoon. So they reproduce very, very quickly. And an adult worm can then produce another cocoon within another week or two. So they make rabbits look like amateurs when it comes to reproduction. So they can reproduce very quickly. So again, if you have those conditions where their metabolism is really well for eating, when they eat a lot, they're going to also reproduce quite a bit too. So you're going to be able to expand that population of the worms in your worm bin. Now, just a little side note too is when we start to get our worm bin quite established, other critters are going to start showing up, whether they've come in from the food waste or it's so bizarre. Like it's just like, where did these all come from? And then 2 days later, they're all gone. It's just like, what? Nature is crazy. So what you'll see typically quite frequently is mites. And mites will show up on different foods. So like I find if I put a lot of avocado peels in, so the peel is a little bit harder. It's got a little bit more kind of lignin kind of material to it, like you would find in tree bark. And the mites will just show up and they're little shredders. That's their job. So they'll start working on this stuff to break it up and make it more fragile. And then when the stuff is all done, they just seem to disappear. It's so bizarre. So you always seem to get mites within the system. And then this little guy in the middle, that's called a potworm. So potworms are very similar to earthworms in how they consume food. They're quite a bit smaller. They just look like a little thread. A lot of people confuse them as baby worms or earthworms, but baby earthworms are actually pink in color. And these guys are okay to have some, but if we start to get too many, they will actually outcompete our earthworms and eat them out of house and home kind of thing. So then all your earthworms will die off and you'll just have potworms. So their biggest indicator is if the conditions become too acidic. So we want to start to change that pH and get some of those eggshells or get some more bedding in there to help soak up some of that moisture. So just be mindful that that ecosystem is constantly changing. It's never going to be just constant. And if you really want to get into more on the vermicomposting, this book is the one that I highly recommend. It's kind of like the vermicomposting Bible. So Mary Appeloff wrote it quite a few years back. So Worms Eat My Garbage. Really good explanations and stuff in there. Tons of different designs and layouts for different bins. And then, yeah, it really just dives into kind of the history and stuff of some of it as well. So really cool little book. And then if you are looking to purchase more of a fancier bin and you don't want to do the DIY kind of thing, and you want to just like, I want to get something nice. There's a new company out of Quebec called Worm Box, and he has all kinds of crazy different styles. So he carries the Worm Factory 360. This other fancier, like chic looking one is called an Herbalive. It's out of Europe somewhere. And he's got a couple other little ones on here too. Some of the bigger ones I'll showcase here in a bit as well. So just depending on what you're looking for, there's worm bins for all kinds of situations and styles and everything. So whatever floats your boat, you can find a worm bin to fit it. And then if you want to get into some of the bigger sides of doing vermicomposting, the worm wigwam is a really good model. So this is what a lot of any of the commercial operations kind of have a similar model of this. They take that style, but they lay it out over the length of the building. So what you have here is you've got a grate at the bottom. So very similar to the chicken wire that we would have seen in some of our flow-through systems. And we start our bedding and everything on this mesh. And then as we start to feed it, the worms will start to go up closer to the top. So once we get up closer to that top, the screen at the bottom has a ratchet that you can that you start to wind up, and it pulls a knife across the top of that mesh, and that forces the worm castings down into the harvest area below, where you can put a bin or something under there. So that way, again, you're never disrupting the worms. You're not taking the worms out. You're feeding from the top and harvesting from the bottom. So where these larger companies are doing something similar is they take that model, instead of round, it's rectangular, and it runs the length of the building, and then that knife goes the whole length of the building and forces that worm castings onto like a conveyor belt or somewhere else that they harvested. So a hungry bin, kind of a similar process. It's also got a little cutting knife. It's just a little bit of a different style. That worm box company also sells these as well. Excuse me. So just a little bit of a different style. I think these guys came out of where the worm. This one is out of Australia. The other one is out of the States. Oh, gonna play the video, but we'll just move past that. And then I came across some of these just recently, and so I don't know if we'll order one or if we'll just kind of play around with making our own. But I think this is more for that kind of education side, so that you could see do the gardening, but then also go and interact with the worms. So there's a cheaper way of doing this, is just taking a PVC pipe and drilling some holes in it, and then just pounding it down into the garden, and then just throwing food scraps down the pipe, and then the worms will come into the holes, grab the food, eat it and stuff there, and then go back out into the garden and take that nutrition with them. So I think this is just kind of a fancier style of doing that on a little bit of a more interactive style. So you can see here, it would be great for schools. So the kids and the children can get in there and play around with the worms, learn about the worms and see that process, but then also be, boom, right there, using it to grow the food and stuff as well. I like that kind of stuff. Got to have the education, right? And then if you want to do larger stuff, you can just even do windrows, and like start the windrow really shallow and put the worms in the top, and then just start adding to the top of your windrow, so it becomes a larger, taller pile, and the worms will process up to the top. That one's a little harder to harvest. Or you can do a wedge pile, where you have basically a wall, or you can use a big chunk of plywood or something, and start piling it in front of the wall, and then just keep extending it out. So then the worms will follow that food out, and then by the time you say you go maybe 10, 20 meters down the pile, then you can start harvesting the worms from the inside.
So we've got a
And
couple
then
of questions, if I can jump in. Is that all right? Okay. Peter commented that apparently Wormbox does not have the Worm Factory right now. It's sold out, but that West Coast Seeds does have one, and it's a little cheaper, so that's nice. And he also asked, what's the risk when we order worms that they might freeze to death during transport?
yeah, so that's definitely a real thing. So we don't ship in the winter unless it's like a local kind of hand to hand to a car. I don't think that many companies probably do because of that risk. Uh, so you either got to make plans to do it in the spring, or find somebody that you can drive a little closer to. And this is something that there's a couple people that I've ran into in Saskatchewan and BC, where they have like a small network of people that are just doing vermicomposting, and then every couple months they're like, oh, I've got too many worms. Who wants some of my worms? So maybe even building a little bit of a kind of connection piece there, and bringing us all together to have a little like worm context.
Oh, that's cool. And Janelle was wondering, and this, you kind of maybe answered this already, but where would the best place to be to order worms from?
Yeah, so Annalita here, this place, they sell it. Earthly Matters sells them out of Coaldale. We sell them working with Earthly Matters. Green Calgary sells them. There's another company, and I'm just having a mind blank of what they're called again. They're out of Medicine Hat area. There's the Dirt Princess out of Okotoks there. You guys have one right in your town. Robin there, she sells them as well. So there's definitely, and then there's a couple guys on Kijiji are kind of on the outskirts of the city that sell them as well.
Great.
Yeah, so I think I just have a couple slides left, but I just wanted to show a picture of what Annalita is doing because it is a pretty neat operation. So they've got kind of like that one style with the knife that cuts the worm castings underneath. They feed the tops of their bins with a gantry, and then they have the knife go through the bottom, and it goes onto a conveyor belt that takes it out to a different or to their collection site. So pretty crazy just to think that they have a room full of worms and processing the waste that way. But really cool. It seems to work really well. And then Earthly Matters doing the vermiculture stuff down in Coaldale area. Really nice looking product. And then this was the first company that I came across. They're out of New York, and he was a feedlot, and he was just having troubles dealing with his manure waste. So he started composting the manure waste and produces a really good product and does the extract and teas and ships it all over Eastern USA. So they've run a very successful company there, and what a way to reduce such a sloppy mess with all that manure waste. So see here, they do big tanks of worm extract. So they're putting it on, golf courses, using it out in commercial ag to minimize on synthetics and landscaping and all that stuff. So pretty cool. And then just a little side note, our worm friends, some guys are doing some trialing and testing with them to help eradicate pathogens for one. So like taking E. coli and salmonella and essentially taking it within their systems and destroying it. But then also there's being some research done where they're putting them into soils that have been contaminated with hydrocarbons and other nasty things. And it seems like the worms are starting to clean up some of these soils. So, just because they're a lowly little creature doesn't mean, they've got a punch to pack. And that's just a little video. He used to keep his worms under his walkways in the greenhouse. So he's just doing stacking his functions. So in the end, soil doesn't like to be treated like dirt. So we got to respect our wormy friends, whether they're out in nature or if we got them in a bin helping us with our food waste. That's what I got on the worms. I'm sure there'll be a few questions and stuff. And if you got anything that wakes you up at 2 or 3 in the morning, don't call me. Send me an email in the morning, and we can help you out that way.
Awesome. Well, as people are typing out their questions, I see somebody's already typing. I'm just going to put in a little plug for the rest of our programming for the year. So we don't have any more green living workshops. This is our last one for the season. So thanks, Mike. But we do have a Christmas decoration swap next Saturday on the 26th. So if you have some old Christmas decorations that you're getting tired of, but they're still in good condition, bring them on by to the Environmental Education Center in Okotoks. That's over by the BMX track in our operations building. And we're going to do a little swap. So we're taking in some decorations from 10 to noon, and then from noon to 4, you can come in and take whatever you want. And new to you, saves you some money, it'll be really fun. So we're looking forward to that. And then every Friday we have Nature Fridays. So it's kind of geared for kids, but it's totally applicable for adults as well. We have a different topic every Friday. So come on out. We're open there from about 9 to 4. So we've got someone there to do some fun programming. Okay, we have some questions. B asks, I enjoy this so much. I have had a worm bin for a couple of years now, but she learned so much this evening. She's just happy to know that she can make her worms even happier. So she just says, thank you. That's so kind. Sandy says, is it best to lift some of the bedding and feed the worms at the opposite side you last fed them?
Yeah, that's a great way of doing it, because then that way you can always kind of keep track of how they're processing the food waste. So, because I know some people, like, this was a problem with a lot of the schools, was they weren't regulating how they were feeding, and so the kids were all just like chucking in tons of food, and then it was way too much in there, and then it started to cause kind of some smell issues and some other stuff like that. So if you get into a system of going back and forth, then you can start to go, okay, oh yeah, they're getting into that. Now I can add some more.
And Janelle says, thank you so much as well. So for those of us who don't have a worm bin and it looks maybe a little daunting, what would be the best way to get started? Would it be maybe to, put the money into one of the more easy systems where it filters it itself, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I was chatting with the people at Green Calgary about this as well, and we're looking at just doing this even like little trial bins. So it would be one of the Rubbermaids that's almost like the size of like a big shoebox. And then that way you just get a little bit of worms. You don't get too many, but enough just to see some of the processing. And then if you like the process, then it'd be easy to kind of scale up from that. Because I know with some people it has been a bit daunting, and then they're so worried and anxious about their worms that they might harm them, that they end up going a little bit too far on them. So if we can just figure out how to do it really easy peasy, and it's a fit for your household or your school classroom or whatever, then that's a great way to trial it, and then you can easily scale up.
That's cool. So if I were to put one in my house, probably you're saying like the mechanical room or the basement somewhere would be a good place to put them where it's not too hot, not too cold and dark, basically. Cool. Might have to try this. Been wanting to for years. You might have just pushed me over the edge here. I don't know. Does anyone else have any more questions for Mike tonight? No one's typing. Did you say that we could request the slide deck from you?
Gotcha.
So Mike's left his email there. If you don't get the chance to write it down or screenshot or whatever you need to do, you can always email us at sustainability@okotoks.ca and we can get a hold of Mike for you as well. And we have recorded this, but we'll see if that becomes available in future. I'll chat with Mike about that. So, all right. I think that is a wrap. So thank you so much for coming tonight, Mike. This was wonderful. I learned a lot. Sounds like everyone else learned a lot. So vermicomposting is fun. It's kind of gross. I love it. It's wonderful. So thank you. All right, everyone, take care. Stay safe.
Have a good night.
Good night.